been asked to discuss the question when elites fail and what we should do about it. There's a simple answer. The simple answer is get rid of them. But then come the hard answers, and those are the ones that you're going to be working on the next couple of days. So that's the important part of this conference. And then the rest of us ought to keep working on continually, because it's going to be a long struggle. I'll just make a couple of background comments about the topic, which I hope will be of some use. First question to ask is, do they fail? And if they do, and for whom, and how? Actually, there's an interesting, simple answer to that by Adam Smith. He, of course, was talking about England, and he pointed out that the principal architects of policy in England, the merchants and manufacturers, make sure that their own interests are very well served, no matter how grievous the effect on others, including the people of England, but particularly those who are subject to what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans. He was thinking particularly of British India, but it generalizes. And that's a pretty accurate answer. Actually, there's a measure of how well it works. It's what's known as the democratic deficit, technically, the gap between public opinion and public policy, which is a pretty good measure of the accuracy of his description. I'll come back to that in a second. Today, it's not the merchants and manufacturers. We might say it's the multinational institutions and the financial institutions, but the principle is about the same. And it does raise the question how they become the architects of policy. And there's some pretty simple answers to that, too. There are a variety of ways. But the easiest one is just buying elections. That works like a charm. There's a sophisticated version of that by a really fine political economist, Tom Ferguson. He calls it the investment theory of politics. And he studied American politics for over a century in these terms. It's a simple idea. Elections are occasions when groups of investors coalesce to invest to buy the state. And that turns out to be a remarkably good predictor of what policy is going to be. It's actually verified strikingly in the Obama administration. I'll come back to that too, but say a word about the democratic deficit. That has a history in our history, this country's history. The country was founded on the principle that there should be a democratic deficit. That's the Madisonian conception. You look back at the debates in the Constitutional Convention, Madison, of course, the main framer, he argued that, he didn't put it in these terms, but he argued basically that democracy is a bad thing. It's dangerous. We have to make sure that the public doesn't become involved in public affairs. So there should be a democratic deficit. And he had a good argument. The model that he had in mind was England, of course. And he said, suppose that in England there was a functioning democracy. Well, then the large majority of the population would use their voting power to carry out what we would call land reform, to take land from the rich who concentrate it in their hands and distribute it themselves, mostly an agrarian society then. And he said that obviously would be unfair. It would be taking away property from the rich. So we can't accept that. He therefore, he was actually raising a question that goes back to the first serious work on politics, Aristotle's book, Politics. Aristotle faced exactly the same question. I don't know if Madison was conscious of this or not. Aristotle considered the various kinds of political systems and their merits and deficiencies, and decided that the least bad, he didn't like any of them, The least bad was democracy, but he noticed that there's a problem, namely Madison's problem. He was talking about Athens, if the poor in Athens could use their voting power, they would take property away from the wealthy, and that's unfair. So they were asking the same question, but they came to opposite conclusions. Aristotle's conclusion was you should get rid of inequality, and he outlined what we would call a welfare state, measures that could be used in Athens to eliminate inequality, so you wouldn't face the problem of the poor using their voting power to take property from the rich. Madison came to the opposite conclusion. He said what you have to do is eliminate democracy. That'll get rid of the problem. So the system that he designed places power primarily in the hands of the Senate, which is the most remote from the population of the various branches of government that were outlined in the Constitution. And he said the Senate should be the wealth of the nation, the more responsible set of men, those who have respect for property owners and their rights. And with that, and the population should kind of be fragmented and marginalized. And that way the government can meet its obligation, in his words, to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority. And that's essentially the Madisonian Compact, and it persists to the present. In fact, a good bit of the history of the last couple hundred years is the struggle between these two answers, Aristotle's answer and Madison's answer. They're right to the present. In fact, we have a huge industry in the United States. It's called the public relations industry, which is founded explicitly on the Madisonian principle. Its founder, leading figure, Edward Bernays, back in the 1920s, expressed the same view. He said that power should be in the hands of the intelligent minority, and in order to achieve that, keep the public out of it, we have to carry out what he called engineering of consent, and that's the task of the public relations industry. He didn't explain how the intelligent minority gain that privilege, but the answer's not very difficult to figure out. By serving power, that makes you the intelligent minority, and then you can manage the society for their interests, following Adam Smith's principle. The progressive democratic theory took exactly the same view. So the leading public intellectual of the 20th century, in his progressive essays on democracy, as they're called, Walter Lippmann, essentially elaborated the same view. He said the public must be kept to this status of spectators, not participants. And the reason is that the majority is ignorant and stupid. And if they're allowed to participate, they'll just make mistakes. So the responsible men, that's us, we have to ensure that we're protected from the trampling and the rage of the bewildered herd, those outsiders, the stupid and ignorant outsiders. And he was expressing a very common view. I mean, it has harsher versions toward the right, but it's a pretty standard view. And it goes way back. The problem goes back to Aristotle, and the possible answers are pretty much those. The public relations industry was founded in the freest countries in the world, in the United States and England. And the reason was straightforward. Enough rights had been won through popular struggles, so you just couldn't control the population by force easily anymore. In fact, most of this was in the 1920s when women finally got the right to vote. A little bit after they got the right to vote in Afghanistan, incidentally. But they did get it, and that meant another, one of the many steps towards, there were parliamentary labor parties, unions. It was just hard to control people by force. So you had to turn to engineering of consent, what Lippmann called manufacture of consent, to ensure that the democratic deficit is sustained. That's a leading principle of democratic theory.